I want to tell you about something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Challenges everything we think we know about loneliness and connection. There's this woman, let's call her Sarah, shared her story online, and it's one of those stories that makes you stop and really think about the assumptions we carry around with us every single day. Sarah is 29 years old, and by conventional standards, she's what most people would call beautiful. Throughout her life, she's experienced the kind of attention that makes many people uncomfortable, the kind she never asked for and often wishes she could turn off like a switch. But here's what most people don't see, what they can't possibly know just by looking at her Sarah lives with a loneliness so profound that it shapes every aspect of her existence. Childhood, Sarah has battled social anxiety rooted in trauma, abuse, and relentless bullying. For years, so painfully shy that speaking to anyone felt like climbing a mountain. She's completely cut off from her family because of the abuse she endured. She has no social circle to speak of. The two people she considers friends live far away and struggle with their own mental health challenges. They don't know the full extent of what Sarah goes through. Every single day, she sits alone in her room, trapped in a cycle of isolation that most people would find unbearable. Her insomnia keeps her awake through the nights. She does venture out to study. She's learned to wear a mask so convincing that nobody could guess the reality of her existence. Social anxiety has improved enough that she can fake normalcy, but there's a wall around her that nobody can penetrate. People talk to her, she listens and responds, but she never reveals anything about her actual life. She lies when she feels she has to. She's become entirely inaccessible as a person, not because she wants to be, because she doesn't know how to be any other way. Here's where it gets really interesting. Everything we think we understand about life and advantages gets turned on its head. Sarah has heard it countless times. Comment people love to throw around women can't be lonely. According to popular wisdom, especially for someone who looks like her, connection should be easy. Dating should be effortless. Friendship should fall into her lap. But Sarah has never been in love. She's never formed a deep connection with another human being. The only relationship she managed to maintain lasted about 6 months. And when it ended, the truth came out in the most devastating way possible. The guy admitted openly that he'd only been with her because of how she looked. For 6 months, Sarah had struggled to act normal, try being in a relationship like everyone else seemed to do so naturally, and he had no idea who she actually was. Not a clue. She's accepted something that breaks my heart to even repeat. She believes she can never fall in love, despite the fact that she craves it desperately. She wants to love someone and be truly loved in return. But it feels impossible reaching for something that exists in another dimension. Her physical desires are real and strong. She can't bring herself to act on them because the idea of casual encounters disgusts her. Sure, she could have physical intimacy whenever she wanted, technically speaking, but it wouldn't mean anything. It wouldn't heal the loneliness. In fact, it would make everything worse because it would confirm her deepest fear that her appearance is her only value, has essentially checked out of reality. Outside of her studies, she lives entirely in daydreams and the stories she writes. Her room is filled with merchandise of fictional characters, and she's developed what she describes as a relationship with them, talking to them, imagining they're the supportive friends she's never had. For almost 15 years, she's been in love with a fictional character. That connection, as imaginary as it is, has become the thing keeping her alive. She can't even connect with people online. She's not part of any community or group. She doesn't have social media. She doesn't play online games. It's as if she doesn't exist at all in the digital world that connects everyone else. She posted her story not looking for advice or sympathy, just to share it somewhere, anywhere for once. She's accepted that this will be her life forever. She wants people to understand is devastatingly simple. Being an attractive woman doesn't magically turn life into easy mode. Women are people, complex and struggling and human, and you never know what someone is hiding just by looking at them. Finding casual physical connection or even a superficial relationship would be easy for her, but those things are worthless when what you want more than anything is a genuine human connection. Now, before we go any further, I want to say something directly to anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation, anyone who feels like they've never been part of a community, they're floating through life completely disconnected from everyone around them. You're welcome here, not in the sense that I'm deciding whether you belong or not. That would be arrogant of me, in the sense that if you want to be part of something, if you're looking for a place where you can share your experience without judgment, the door is open. Whether you feel like this is your community or not is entirely your choice, but the invitation stands. If you'd like to join people who would genuinely love to have you. This story is incredibly important because it addresses something we constantly lose sight of in our culture. There's this widespread assumption, almost a cultural mythology, that being physically attractive is a cure all for life's problems. People genuinely believe that if you're beautiful or handsome, friendship comes naturally, romantic relationships fall into your lap, opportunities appear out of nowhere, and life just works out. They think physical attractiveness is some kind of miracle solution that fixes everything, but it doesn't work that way. It really doesn't. And this is what makes the situation so incredibly difficult for people like Sarah, because we live in a society that has decided attractiveness equals an easy life. What are you supposed to say when you're attractive and your life is falling apart? How do you get people to understand your struggle when everyone looks at you and thinks you have everything? When people tell you that you could get into a relationship anytime you want, that you could have physical intimacy whenever you desire it, that you should be grateful for your advantages. There might be dozens of people who would claim they'd love to date someone like Sarah. They'd see her as a person and value her for who she is. But here's the thing, everyone is craving something. Everyone wants something they don't have. And when you have something that others desperately want, even if it's not actually helping you, they often can't see past their own desire for it. They can't understand that the very advantage they're craving might actually be making your life harder in ways they can't imagine. This is the paradox nobody talks about. The advantages that everyone assumes will make your life easy can actually make it devastatingly difficult. That's almost impossible to explain to people who aren't in a frame of mind to listen, too caught up in their own struggles and desires to consider that your experience might be valid even though you have something they want. Think about what it's like to enter a relationship when you're physically attractive. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, people only see the surface. They're interested in how you look, and that becomes the entire foundation of the connection. Sarah experienced this firsthand. Someone dated her for 6 months, and all that time, they were only there because of her appearance. Do you understand how that feels? For half a year, she tortured herself trying to find a real connection with this person, trying to be normal, trying to make it work like everyone else seems to manage. And in the end, she discovered that none of it mattered because he was never interested in her as a person. Sure, physical attractiveness might make it easier to get into relationships, statistically speaking. That's not enough to address the crushing loneliness that eats away at you from the inside. In fact, it can reinforce that loneliness because you start to understand why people are really there. They're not there for you. They're there for what you look like. You're one accident away from having no value at all. One scar, one injury, one change to your appearance. And suddenly, everything you thought you had disappears because it was never really about you in the first place. This is the thing that makes life so challenging for people whose worth gets tied up in their appearance. Society looks at them and thinks their attractiveness is their value, that it gives them countless advantages, and sometimes that actually becomes their lived experience. Their identity starts to form around how they look because that's what everyone responds to. Consider this scenario. If you're an attractive woman and you get a job, what do people attribute your success to? If you get promoted, what do they say? Now, to be fair, most people will probably attribute it to your abilities, your work ethic, your talent. Most people are reasonable, but some aren't. Some people will make comments about how you only got the job because of your looks, whisper that you must be sleeping with the boss to get ahead. They'll make jokes that cut deep, even though they're trying to be funny. You might be thinking, why does it matter what a small minority of people think? If 95 or 98% of people are reasonable and fair, why are we focusing on the 2% who are jerks? Here's why. How many people does it take to ruin your day? How many people does it take to ruin your life? How many people does it take to turn an achievement you worked hard for into something that feels hollow and meaningless? That's why we're talking about this. That's why it matters. When you're lonely and attractive and you finally manage to have a relationship, that one relationship involves someone who doesn't treat you like a person, who admits they were only there for your appearance, sinks in deep. It confirms everything you feared. It validates your worst thoughts about yourself. Torture yourself for months trying to find a connection, and when it ends, you're left with the confirmation that your deepest fears were justified all along. The challenge here is that somewhere along the way, our culture started gatekeeping suffering. We started looking at people's advantages and deciding they weren't allowed to struggle. We began invalidating people's experiences based on external factors we could see. We started saying that if you're attractive, you're not allowed to be lonely because everyone would want to be friends with you. You're not allowed to be socially anxious because obviously people would want to spend time with someone who looks like you. There probably is data showing that attractive people have more friendships on average than others. That's not a surprising finding. But here's what we need to understand: each and every one of us is an individual human being. No single feature determines who we are as a person. In fact, the reason this creates such profound loneliness is precisely because when you're attractive, one feature often becomes the only thing other people see. This isn't just about attractiveness, by the way. This applies to any dominant characteristic that defines how others perceive you. Maybe you're the oldest son of a wealthy family, and everyone looks at you and sees expectations and pressure and dynasty. Maybe you're attractive, and everyone assumes your life must be easy. When things are supposed to be easy, when everyone tells you that you're playing life on easy mode, that you have the golden ticket, how does it feel when things are actually hard? It's devastating. Failing at life is one thing. Failing at life when you're supposedly playing on easy mode destroys who you are as a person. It destroys your capacity for self-love. What do we do about this? First, we need to understand that sometimes when people have a feature that's supposed to fix loneliness, the world tells them should prevent loneliness, they can fall into using that feature as a crutch to connect with others. If you're attractive and lonely, you might fall into casual physical relationships. You're looking for something deeper. The loneliness is so heavy and crippling that you'll use anything available to make it go away, even just for a little while. There's a neurochemical component to this loneliness. After physical intimacy, after lying with someone, your body releases oxytocin, one of the hormones involved in bonding. It's responsible for the connection between mothers and infants, for romantic pair bonding, why friends with benefit situations can get complicated. When you cuddle after being intimate with someone, even someone you're not emotionally connected to, you start catching feelings. That's oxytocin at work. If you're lonely and craving human connection, physical intimacy can give you a piece of that feeling. There's even research on oxytocin and social connection. Some researchers tried giving people with schizophrenia, who often struggle to form emotional connections, oxytocin nasal spray to see if it would help them bond with others. Data wasn't particularly promising, but it shows how central this neurochemical is to human connection. When you're desperately lonely, you'll use anything available to get your needs met. You crave connection so intensely that you'll engage in physical relationships even when they're not what you really want. Mentioned she tried the casual route and it didn't work for her, which is probably a step in the right direction. You have to be careful about what you use to meet your needs. If you use physical intimacy to connect with people, yes, there's oxytocin involved. Yes, there's some bonding happening. That connection is somewhat artificial because it's based on them not knowing who you really are. Something devastating can happen over time. You start to learn that the only way to get this feeling of connection is through physical intimacy. You're lonely day after day until you're intimate with someone. And then for a few moments, you feel connected. If that becomes the only way you can connect with people, what does that do to your sense of identity? It cripples it because now the only worth you bring as a person is through your body. That's the only way you can connect with anyone. This creates a vicious cycle. You're getting your needs met through unhealthy relationships, and those unhealthy relationships reinforce the negative parts of yourself that make it hard to truly connect in the first place. If you're not worth more than your body, why would anyone want to connect with who you really are? You can't risk showing people your true self because you believe that self is ugly, while what you look like is attractive. You become terrified to actually engage with people even though connection is what you crave most desperately. Now, I imagine some people hearing this might be reacting strongly. Some might be thinking they're lonely and unattractive. Take physical intimacy plus loneliness over loneliness with nothing any day of the week. The thought of being able to have physical connection whenever you want sounds like the ultimate answer to their problems. Might be wondering what Sarah is complaining about because it sounds amazing to them. Others might be thinking similar things, wondering what the complaint is when there are so many advantages to being an attractive woman in this world. If you're having that reaction, I want you to notice what you're doing to the other person. Sarah is telling you she's suffering. She has something you don't have. And yes, there may be advantages to that thing. And yes, you can want that thing. But you're assuming her experience is incorrect. You're depriving her of the capacity to suffer and connect with others because you're judging her rather than acknowledging who she is as a person and treating her with compassion. You're saying she has no right to complain. Here's the key thing to understand. When you try to share your own suffering with other people, how do they react? When you say you're lonely, when you say it's impossible to find a date, when you say you're never going to experience intimacy, what does the world tell you? They laugh it off. They tell you to just work on yourself. They tell you it's all in your head. They say you can fix it. They invalidate your experience. The world does to you exactly what you're doing to Sarah right now. When the world invalidates us, sometimes we lean into communities that say, yes, your suffering is justified. Your suffering is real. And then we separate ourselves, creating divisions between groups of suffering people who can't see each other's pain. I'm not saying advantages don't exist. Absolutely do. I've seen it firsthand throughout my career. I remember being a medical student and walking into patient rooms where people assumed I was a doctor because I'm a man of Indian descent. My female colleagues, who were actually doctors, were assumed to be nurses. Those advantages are real. They don't automatically translate to happiness or fulfillment or connection. I've worked as a psychiatrist with people who are homeless and struggling, and with people who are partners at investment banks and struggling. Suffering doesn't discriminate based on advantages. There's even research showing that financial security correlates with happiness up to a certain point. We're not saying circumstances have no influence. What I want you to focus on is how you treat other people when they share their suffering. This is crucial. When someone posts about their struggles, we often focus entirely on what they should do differently. We give them all the responsibility for fixing their situation. But sometimes, if someone is struggling, it's not entirely their fault. We're all products of our environment, shaped by the judgments people make about us. Our lives are determined in part by how others see us and treat us. If you're listening to this and feeling resentful because you don't understand why Sarah is complaining, because you think you have it so much harder, I'm not saying you don't have it hard. What I'm saying is that comparing who has it harder doesn't actually help anyone. It doesn't reduce anyone's suffering or increase anyone's connection. I spent time working on a trauma unit, and one pattern emerged clearly. People would instinctively compare their trauma. Who was emotionally abused would hear from someone who was physically abused that their experience was worse. Who was physically abused would hear from someone who was sexually abused that their trauma was more severe. And none of this comparison helped anyone heal. Why do people do this? Because when they shared their own story of suffering, invalidated them. Someone told them they didn't deserve to suffer, that they should stop complaining, learned that some suffering is legitimate and some isn't, that there's a hierarchy of pain, and they started applying that same invalidation to others. It's not about statistics or advantages or who has it objectively worse. How we treat each other as human beings. When someone says they're suffering, how do you respond? When you shared your suffering, how did someone respond to you? And what I find beautiful about this situation is that when Sarah shared her experience, a community heard her and said, "We hear you, it sounds tough. And by the way, I didn't know attractive women could feel this way." That's where real healing comes from. That's where connection grows. Let me say it again, you're welcome here. Now let's talk about what you can do if you're in a situation like Sarah's. Generally, people are judged primarily based on one feature, whether that's appearance or wealth or family background. Their identity starts to split. There's the real you, and there's the way the world treats you. The more you get judged based on how you look, the more isolated you feel. And paradoxically, the worse you start to feel about who you actually are as a person. Think about it this way. If you have a birthday party and 10 people bring gifts and one of them brings a pile of feces, that ruins your day. Even if 9 people brought wonderful gifts and told you how much they value you, one person who brought something awful dominates your experience. If 9 people tell you you're amazing and one person tells you they hope you cease to exist, that one person's words echo in your mind far longer than the 9 people's kindness. This is a fundamental problem with how human psychology works. It's so much easier to hurt someone than to help them. As people develop and get treated in specific ways based on their identity, they start to realize their worth is being determined by external factors rather than internal ones. If you're attractive and people attribute your achievements to your looks rather than your abilities, your actual sense of self starts to diminish. The more people talk about your success being due to your attractiveness or your wealth or your advantages, the worse you feel about yourself as a person. When you start feeling bad about yourself, you compensate in various ways. Develop strong ego defenses or narcissistic patterns. You can see this in public figures. Some people accomplish impressive things. Nobody says, "Good job, that's impressive." Instead, everyone says, "You only got there because you were born with advantages." And then you see those people develop egotistical responses, and the whole thing becomes a destructive cycle. The idea of having compassion for someone who seems advantaged becomes almost unthinkable. What do you do if you're in this situation where you've learned that your worth is based on your appearance? It sounds difficult. Here's what you need to find out who you are. Who you are is not determined by how you're treated. That's why we call it treatment. How people relate to you, it's not your identity. The problem is that we tend to conflate the two. For people with strong egos, their identity becomes entirely based on how they're treated. When people treat them with respect, they feel on top of the world. When people treat them with disrespect, they feel worthless. This is narcissism in its clinical form. To protect themselves, they have to force people to treat them with respect because they can't tolerate when people don't, because their entire sense of self depends on external validation. This is why some people always need to be the center of attention and can't tolerate criticism. You have to find out who you are. How do you do that? First, spend time with yourself. You might think, but I'm lonely. I do that all day. But there's a subtle difference between being at home, wanting to be with someone else, and actually spending quality time with yourself. Before starting my work today, I went for a walk. I went with myself. I spent time letting my thoughts happen, thinking through things, recognizing I needed time to process and plan. Sometimes I love eating alone at a restaurant when I get the chance. People might look at you and think how pathetic that you're eating alone, but let them think what they want. Genuinely want to enjoy my food my way. Usually I eat out with my kids, which is wonderful but chaotic. I don't have time to enjoy my food because I'm managing orders and preventing disasters and making sure elbows don't knock over water cups. Anyone with young children understands this completely. Spend time with yourself. Go for a hike. Nature is fantastic for this because nature doesn't care about ego. If you go on a hike alone and start feeling tired after 2 hours and want to turn back, you can. There's no one there to judge you as weak. But if you're with someone else, you might not turn back because you don't want to be perceived as weak. Even if you accomplish the goal of completing the hike, you don't feel pride because you did it to avoid appearing weak. Actually enhances ego and increases insecurity. If you go alone and decide to turn back, that's your choice and yours alone. No one judges you except yourself. If you push through and reach the summit, no one's there clapping. You don't feel elated. Feel like, thank goodness it's over. Now I have to go back down. No one's celebrating you or calling you amazing for walking for 4 hours at a mild incline. You're telling yourself it's no achievement because that's the toxic part of you that developed from being unable to connect authentically. Do that enough times and you'll start to realize that actually it isn't true. You did accomplish something. You can be proud of this. You have to start somewhere. Even if you can't feel proud initially, you still did it. You set your mind to something and followed through. Find out who you are, and that happens first and foremost with yourself. The next thing is to reach out to someone else in an authentic way. Sarah did by posting her story. No one is going to appreciate you for who you are unless you actually show them. This is where things get terrifying because if you really show people who you are, you open the door to rejection, especially if you're an attractive woman who's lonely. That's devastating. If you pretend to be okay, everyone thinks your life is great. But if you turn to them and say you're actually struggling and lonely and have difficulty connecting, what's terrifying is that they might respond with, "What are you talking about? You're so attractive. You shouldn't have problems." In that moment, you're opening the door for them to reject you. The challenge of connecting with another human being is that in order to be accepted by someone, door must be open for them to reject you as well. We're so afraid of rejection that we never risk it. Therefore, we never give anyone the chance to accept us. So we stay stuck in loneliness. The good news is that a lot of this fear is in our heads. Mean people exist? Absolutely. Had an experience with someone who was completely shallow, but compassionate people exist too. When Sarah shared her story, people responded with listening and compassion. That work of connection wasn't done by any one person. It was done by a community of people who chose to respond with kindness. Sarah mentioned being overwhelmed by the responses and support, not having time to reply to everyone who reached out. That's the power of human compassion when we choose to offer it. Be careful about who you open up to, absolutely. But you have to give people a chance to reject you if you want to be accepted. Let me recap what we've covered. Someone posted about being an attractive woman who's lonely and, for a large portion of humanity, doesn't compute. Being attractive is supposed to be the antidote to loneliness. If you're attractive, especially if you're a woman, you should be able to make friends easily, have intimate relationships whenever you want. It sounds amazing to people who don't have those advantages. The truth is that advantages are never a substitute for happiness or protection from suffering. Do advantages help? Absolutely. Some of them are quite significant, but they're not a substitute for genuine connection. Attractiveness is not a substitute for connection. In fact, attractive people can be incredibly lonely, and here's why. Anytime someone interacts with them, they're often not interacting with a person. They're interacting with the shell, the appearance. They're not interacting with you. They're interacting with what you look like. The more people interact with your appearance instead of your person, the lonelier you become. The real challenge is that if you share this with people, they often get upset. People who are hurt and lonely themselves without your advantages turn to you and say, "How dare you complain when I'm in the same situation, except I don't even have your advantages." In that moment, they invalidate your experience. They do this because that's what was done to them. When people reached out for help, when they said they were struggling, someone told them they were wrong, that it was all in their head, that they could fix it if they just did this or that. So what do? Be careful about the strategies you use to satisfy loneliness. There are things we do to make ourselves feel less lonely that aren't authentic. Sometimes people offer physical intimacy. Sometimes they offer money, paying for everything so friends will show up. We use our advantages to reduce loneliness. But in those moments, we're actually reinforcing it because these aren't authentic connections. We're buying them, paying a specific price. Be extremely careful about that cycle, especially when there's only one thing that seems to work, whether that's offering your body or your money. The more you connect with people that way, the more it reinforces the problem because they're not connecting with you. They're showing up for what you provide, not who you are. You don't want to be alone, so you pay whatever price necessary, but it doesn't actually solve the underlying problem. Get in touch with yourself. Find out who you are. If you have trouble connecting with others, the hardest reason is that you're not sure who you are. You don't know what there is to connect to. You don't know if you're worth being friends with. if you don't have that confidence in yourself, connecting with people becomes incredibly difficult because there's so much uncertainty. What if you're actually not worth connecting with? How do you find out? Spend time with yourself. Start to realize, and this is what healthy inner work looks like, that you are who you are. Not everyone is going to like it, and that's okay. Your value as a human being is not determined by getting specific people to like you or hang out with you. But when we struggle with our own identity, that's exactly what it becomes. Suddenly, one person's opinion means everything. If they agree to date you, it means you're good. If they don't, it means you're bad. The next thing you must do to connect is open the door for rejection, because in order for someone to truly accept you, which is what connectedness feels like, you need them to see you and say, I recognize you're flawed, I recognize you're complex, and I like you anyway. When you're attractive, people like you despite who you are. The attractiveness outweighs the negatives. If you really want connection, that needs to change. You can't have people accepting you because you're attractive despite the bad stuff. You need people to accept you in spite of your flaws, not for advantages that supposedly outweigh them. You want people to accept you where both flaws and advantages are just parts of who you are, and they accept the whole package. It's not about balancing or hitting a threshold. It's about being seen completely. Finally, consider working with a therapist if you struggle with social anxiety or similar challenges. A clinical evaluation can help determine if therapy is appropriate. Even if you're not clinically ill, good therapist can be incredibly helpful. From what I understand, people in situations like Sarah's often do well in coaching environments as well, particularly women who struggle with discovering who they are and facing judgment from the world. Someone asked a great question. People share experiences like this online or in real life. How do we know when it's just venting versus when they need actual advice? Often they'll tell you directly. Sarah said explicitly she wasn't posting for advice or pity. If they don't tell you, you can ask. It sounds simple, but it works. Even in professional settings, you can ask what someone is looking for, whether they want support or guidance. Those are usually the two words to use because venting and advice have certain connotations. You can ask if they're looking for feedback or if they just want to vent. Often it's safe to assume it's venting. And if they want advice, ask. I tend to default to support rather than guidance. Another question came up about conditions or boundaries that impact connection. For example, someone who says they aren't ready for love but want to be treated as though they're loved. That's tricky because it puts the other person in an awkward situation. It's confusing. How do you treat someone with love who's not ready for love? That sounds like something that needs exploration. If they're not ready for love but want its treatment, there's work to be done there. If you're trying to have a relationship with such a person, I'd clarify what that means. What does it mean to not be ready for love? What does it mean to be treated with love? If you're the person who feels this way, ask yourself what that means. What makes you not ready? Why do you want to be treated with love? What hunger does that fill? It's a great starting point, but requires deeper understanding. The fundamental message here is about how we treat each other, how we respond to suffering, how we validate or invalidate each other's experiences. Everyone is fighting battles we can't see. Advantages don't eliminate suffering. They sometimes create different forms of it, forms that are harder to talk about because others can't understand why you'd struggle when you seem to have everything. Loneliness doesn't discriminate. Connection doesn't come from having advantages. It comes from being seen, truly seen, by another human being who chooses to stay after seeing who you really are. That's what we're all searching for, whether we're attractive or not, wealthy or not, advantaged or not. We're searching for someone to see us and say that we're enough exactly as we are, flaws and all.